Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It is an incredible honor and pleasure to be here. We were driving here from Calgary, and Shaykh Dawood, hafidhahullah, may Allah bless and preserve him, was giving us a little bit of a forewarning when we're coming. He's like, listen, this is a long drive. It's a flat drive, and there really isn't much to see on your way here. And yet, subhanAllah, making that drive and coming here and to see the faces of the young and old brothers and sisters gathered in the remembrance of Allah, wallahi, there are few sights in the world greater than this right now. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ, he said in a gathering similar to this, Allahumma ajlasakum illa hada. By Allah is the only thing that gathered you, is the remembrance of Allah. Think about, you went home, you got dressed, you made sure that your hijab matches your shoes, you made sure that you presented the best version of yourself, and you left your home pursuing nothing but the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Sahaba, they confirmed to the Messenger of Allah, yes, the only thing that gathered us is the remembrance of Allah. The Prophet ﷺ, he looked to them and he says, Inna Allah yubahi bikumul malaika. That Allah Jalla Jalaluh, the creator of the heavens and the earth, he's boasting of you to the angels. Takhayalu ma'i, your name, my name, in the heavens right now, being mentioned because of this gathering right now. We ask Allah to gather us again and again in His remembrance. You know, there's something to be said about what happens when you end up in gatherings like this. And one of the things that happens when you're in gatherings like this is you find the capacity to connect with Allah and the words of Allah and the prophets of Allah in a way that you never imagined possible. And one of the things that we end up doing is we travel through the Quran. As our beloved Shaykh was mentioning, this idea of engaging and interacting and understanding the Quran, it becomes that we view the Quran as one of the Salaf, he says, رَسَائِلٌ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ إِلَيْكُمْ. تخيلوا, imagine this moment with me, that he says that the Quran becomes like messages from your Lord to you. Imagine right now your phone buzzes, it vibrates, or it makes a sound and you pick it up and it's a text message from the most beloved of people to you. Your heart begins to feel warm and fuzzy. You're excited, you want to see what funny meme they sent you, what reel on Instagram reminded them of you. You get excited that they're thinking of you. And he's describing the Quran as messages from Allah to you. When Allah revealed the Quran, my dear brothers and sisters, it was revealed for you and I. Every letter of the Quran, every harakah of the Quran, Allah revealed for you and I. And every story of the Quran, every journey of the Quran is one that has incredible healing for you and I. And so one of those stories that I've come to learn to appreciate is the story of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. Growing up at, subhanAllah, every major intersection of your life, it's important to have a part of the Quran, at least one part that resonates with you. We all had the phase where Surah Yusuf it was our jam. You fall into Surah Yusuf, it's what gets you going, it's what lifts you up. You feel like you're at the bottom of a well, you feel like you don't know how you're gonna get out, and Surah Yusuf just shines light on you. Other times in your life, you find the story of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam. And the story of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam shows you that even when the waves of the oceans of this life feel like they'll never stop, that Allah can split every ocean and every wave in front of you. And the examples go on and on and on. We find in our most lowly of moments, most difficult of moments, most desperate of moments, we may even connect with Sayyidah Maryam alayhi salam. Sayyidah Maryam is sitting under the tree, not lacking an ounce of iman, no disconnect between her and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And yet she's sitting there giving birth under a tree, all alone. The way that so many of us struggle with loneliness. The way that so many of us feel alone even when we're surrounded with people. And she's at such a difficult intersection of her life that she says, Ya laytani mittu qabla hadha. If only I didn't live to see this moment, from how difficult it weighed on her heart. Every story of the Quran speaks to us differently. And yet one story of the Quran that has proven to lift me and heal me personally time and time and time again is the story of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. And the story of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, we get to see it from every angle. Him as a father, him as a son, him as a husband. We get to see him as a relative, him as a leader, him as a community member. We get to see him as a child, him as a youth, him as an elder. We get to see, subhanallah, Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam in every dimension that he was. Isn't that incredible? Even when you start from the early chapters of the life of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, you find Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam like so many of our young brothers and sisters, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to honor them, to be shaded under the throne the day that there is no shade but that shade for being in this gathering right now. We find him pushing back on the mainstream message to worship other than Allah, to live a life in pursuit of the dunya. He pushed back. He pushed back on the streets and he pushed back in his home. In Surah Maryam, we hear the dialogue between Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam and his father. And he spoke to his father with the most adab, with the greatest respect. Our mashayikh, hafidhahumullah, they'll tell you that there's no better way to refer to your father than to say, Ya abati. And he spoke to his father. He advised his father. He tried to embrace his father. He tried to guide his father. Like so many of us have conversations like that with our own parents and our own children. And yet Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam is an example that even when you do everything right, sometimes things just go completely wrong and they don't happen the way that you want. And his father pushed back, and his father threatened him, and his father exiled him. And Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, even when that most valuable of relationships was stripped away from him, he chose to make the greatest decision that you and I can make today. My dear brothers and sisters, do you know what that is? He chose to befriend Allah. Do you know why? Because Allah is a friend that never leaves. Allah is a friend that never abandons. Allah is a friend that never forsakes you. And that is exactly what Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam did. As one of the scholars, he says, what did the person lose if they have Allah? And what did the person gain if they don't have Allah? Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam showed us this even in the darkest of moments, that the relationship that he centered his entire existence around was his relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one of the authentic collections of hadith, we hear about that moment that Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam was being catapulted into a fire. Because why? And this is important to sit with. These are not Disney-made stories like Finding Nemo. This is Allah telling us a reality of the past. Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam is being catapulted in a fire simply because he believed and said what you and I say and do. Because he called and believed in La ilaha illallah. The narration tells us that when he is mid-air, being catapulted into a fire because of a belief that you and I have, Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam is approached by Sayyidina Jibreel. And Jibreel alayhi salam asks him, "O Ibrahim, do you need help right now?" And in one of the narrations it says that Ibrahim alayhi salam says, "If it is from you, Jibreel, then no. But Allah's help and Allah's support and Allah's victory is something I need right now and always. Hasbi Allahu wa ni'mal wakil. My Lord is Allah and He is enough for me. Hasbi Allah. Allah is enough for me. وَنِعْمَ الْوَكِيلُ. And who better for me to trust in? That moment, even in the darkest of moments, he chose to be the friend of Allah Ta'ala. And sometimes we wonder and we begin to feel like there's like this change of dynamic. There's this phenomenal deception that humans do to themselves, as Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah refers to it in the Ihya. He says one of the greatest deceptions that we deceive ourselves is we think in moments in our life that we have the capacity to judge the decree of Allah, instead of that to be a moment where Allah is judging us. Why did Allah do this to me? How often do we think that or even say it out loud? Why did I lose my job? How could this happen to my family? Why is my loved one struggling with cancer? And we ask Allah Ta'ala, through all of His beautiful names and attributes, وَبِسْمِهِ الْأَعْظَمِ, to make it easy for each and every single one of us going through a difficulty and calamity. And yet Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, in the middle of the air with a fire that's burning right there, instead of questioning Allah, he sought comfort from Allah. He leaned into his relationship with Allah. And what did Allah remind us? That when we turn to Allah and we fall into the hands of Allah Ta'ala, even the impossible becomes possible, because nothing is impossible for Allah. Ya nar, kuni bardan wa salaman ala Ibrahim. Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam did not know what it would look like for Allah to take care of him at that moment, but he knew he wanted to be in the care of Allah, and Allah did the impossible for him. That's what happens when we befriend Allah. And Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, he did not just live this within himself, he lived it within his home. And that's why I invite you, my dear brothers and sisters, to have conversations like this in our homes. Have conversations about a single ayah of the Quran. Have a collection like Riyadus Salihin in your home. And when you're sitting at the dinner table, pull out one hadith and say, what does this hadith mean to you? Ask your 8-year-old child, what does this hadith mean to you? Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam was not just the prophet of the people. He was the prophet of his family. And we witness the impact of that many years later. After so many years of making dua for children, Allah Ta'ala blesses Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam with Ismail. And Allah Ta'ala tests Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. And so many of us feel like our tests from Allah, it's like they're back to back, again and again and again. And we might even feel the courage to ask out loud, or maybe even to ourselves, like, man, it would be nice to catch a break for a little bit. And yet the reality is, one of the Salaf, he said something beautiful. He says, sometimes Allah gives us bala because Allah loves to hear your voice calling upon Him. And that's why Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, he says that the difference between a musibah and a bala, a calamity and just a test or a trial, is how you choose to react to it. And if you choose to react to a trial or tribulation then by returning to Allah, then what greater outcome can you have than that? Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam is commanded by Allah, after asking Allah to be blessed with a child for years, Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam is asked to abandon his wife and child in the middle of the desert. I want you to imagine that with me. Mothers and fathers, I want you to imagine that moment with me. Leave them in the desert with no further explanation. I think about dropping off my son to school. We ask Allah to bless and preserve him. First day of preschool. I drop him off. I don't know who had a harder time, me or him. And I remember thinking about leaving that moment, not knowing when I was going to see, not fully knowing that it was just a few hours that I wasn't going to see him. And think about Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam not knowing when or if he was going to see them again in a barren desert. And that moment, the moments that we leave things for Allah, the moment that you leave addictions for the sake of Allah, the moment that you leave bad habits for the sake of Allah, the moment that you leave toxic and problematic relationships for the sake of Allah, those moments are difficult. Even if your iman is strong. Sayyidina Ibrahim ﷺ is walking away from his mother, walking away from his wife and his child rather. And Sayyidina Ibrahim ﷺ is struggling with this moment so much that it's described in the books of tafsir that he couldn't even look back at them. His wife started to call him. And then she called him and she says, "You're leaving us here. Is this the command of Allah? Allah amaraka bihada? Is it that Allah commanded you to do what you are doing right now, abandoning us and leaving us in the middle of the desert?" My dear brothers and sisters, he couldn't even look back and say yes. He just nodded his head from how difficult that moment was for him. She responded because she grew up in the house of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. She saw the impact of faith. She knew what happens when you and I, 1400 years after the revelation of the chapters of the Quran came down, what happens when we choose to befriend Allah. When her husband was struggling, she says, "Idhan lan yudayyi'an Allah." If it is Allah that commanded you to be here, then for a fact, Allah will not abandon us. Allah will not leave us alone. You see, Sayyidina Ibrahim, even when you are not with us, Allah remains with us. A few hours later, her child became hungry and she had no more milk to feed her child. And subhanAllah, I was mentioning in Calgary that the mother is the greatest manifestation of Allah's rahmah on this earth. Amongst it is the mother. Nothing like a mother in the world. We ask Allah to bless our mothers and preserve our mothers. We ask Allah to reward our mothers for all the care that they provide for us. And we beg of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make our mothers the queens of Jannah. Say Ameen. Hajar alayhi salam is holding baby Ismail. And she hears the cry. And a mother has this incredible capacity to read and understand the cry. My wife can tell me if my daughter's crying is that she, has been wearing the diaper for too long, or if she needs to be fed, or if she's just fussy for the sake of being fussy, or she's just faking it so that we can pick her up and laugh with her. She knows to read the cry. And Sayyidah Hajar alayhi salam, she knew that cry meant that Ismail was hungry. But she knew that her friend was Allah and Allah was with her. She was like you and I, between a rock and a hard place, not knowing where relief was going to come from. But she began to pivot between Safa and Marwa. Back and forth, back and forth. How many of you have been to Umrah by a show of hands? MashaAllah. We ask Allah to invite each and every single one of you to go to Umrah. One of the things that you'll realize, two things I'll tell you when you go to Umrah. One thing that you'll realize is that the Kaaba itself is way bigger than people expect. Am I right? The Kaaba itself is way bigger than people expect. And low-key, the distance between Safa and Marwa is way longer than I expected. And she ran between Safa and Marwa, and I'm just sitting there casually cruising, taking a Zamzam break in between. She ran back and forth, Safa and Marwa, Safa and Marwa. One of the scholars, he talks about that moment of desperation. When she's running between Safa and Marwa, she's not imagining in her wildest dreams that Allah Ta'ala was going to send the same angel that brought down wahi to the Anbiya and to the Mursaleen. She did not imagine in her wildest dreams that something of that sort would happen for her. But what she knew is that Allah would send relief. In fact, her running between the mountains makes it seem like she might have even had a hypothesis of what it means for Allah to help her. Maybe she thought the way that you and I think, that the way that Allah can help me is by giving me this job. Or the way that Allah can help me is by getting me married by 23. Or the way that Allah can help me is that I finally buy a house or get a car. But she didn't know what it was going to look like for Allah to help her. But she knew that Allah is Allah. وَمَا كَانَ رَبُّكَ نَسِيًّا. And Allah doesn't forget anybody. وَلَا يَظْلِمُ رَبُّكَ أَحَدًا. And Allah does not shorthand anyone or anything. And as she was waiting for that moment, maybe thinking a caravan would just pass by, all of a sudden, the angel came and Zamzam, he struck the earth and the water gushed. Until today, that moment of a friend of Allah in which Allah gave her an unanticipated and unimaginable relief, you go there in the middle of the desert and you drink from the same source of water. Because that's what Allah does for the people that befriend Him. Allah does not forget them. Allah does not abandon them. Choose to be a friend of Allah. Choose to have Allah be a part of every chapter of your life. The choice to be the friend of Allah is one that we can make right now. And the most magical part about it, or the most incredible part about it, is that Allah has already chosen to be with you. He asks us in the Quran, Ya ayyuhal insan, O human being, ma gharraka bi rabbika al-kareem. What on earth could distract you from your Lord, the one who has been nothing but generous to you? Choose to have Allah as your friend. And that, my dear sister and my dear brother, will be the greatest choice of your life. Be vulnerable with Allah. Be raw with Allah. Be real with your heart. Take your heart like a bottle and pour it out to Allah each and every single day. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from the friends of Allah. We beg of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those who turn to Him by night and by day. We ask Allah Jalla Jalaluh to make us from those who are friends of the friends of Allah. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us for our sins. هذا والله أعلم وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.